This is the vlog for November 12th, 2018, and today is a bit of a low and a bit of a high day. Um, the news has been released that Stan Lee, creator of characters like The Incredible Hulk, Spider-Man, and countless others, has passed away at the age of 95. Stan Lee was like the fun uncle for three generations of comic book readers at least, and he was sort of the goodwill ambassador for the entire comic industry. And he was a man who encouraged thinking outside established sort of conventions, especially in regards to not just comic books, but literature aimed at children in general. Um, he recognized that fans of his earlier work were still reading and getting older and were in many cases past the age where you would put down things like comic books, which were for kids, but still reading them. And he introduced ideas that were often thought not suitable for young people, like racism or drug use or the simple difficulty of trying to be both a superhero and a regular person, especially with Spider-Man. He was the kind of guy that asked questions, and sometimes very difficult questions, like what does a superhero do in his free time? What happens if a superhero can't afford to be a superhero? Um, Superman never has financial problems. Bruce Wayne certainly doesn't, and as Batman, that's sort of his shtick, is that he uses his fortune to build tools to fight crime, but Spider-Man has no fortune. He is a regular person who is given extraordinary gifts and decides to do, at first, things to make money, and then later, incredibly heroic acts with them. And while he's had his issues with legality and the ownership of certain ideas, disputes in court, Stan Lee was still the kind of guy who encouraged people to talk about their experiences reading comics with him and wanted people to enjoy their free time and feel like, that there was good in the world. Even if it existed in the pages of comics, it could turn into real goodness and make real people better people. And the world is sadder for his loss, but he had 95 years and he left an indelible mark on the comic world and history in general. So, Excelsior, Mr. Lee, and thank you. Now, for the highlight of the day, and this actually was brought up to me before I got news of Mr. Lee's passing. Pokemon Detective Pikachu, the movie. Now, this is one of those things where it's like, okay, I used to work for Nintendo. Maybe I had no idea. I had heard probably the same time the general public did that Ryan Reynolds had been approached to voice a character, namely Pikachu in Detective Pikachu, but nobody really understood what that meant. I know that I certainly thought that they were talking about an animated film. There have been many animated Pokemon movies, all made in Japan and then localized in the United States. And Reynolds is a pretty big actor, be lending his name to a cartoon voice, but it's not unheard of. Occasionally you get really big people to do cartoon voices, and it's usually a pretty great time for everybody. This is not that. This is not what I was expecting. Detective Pikachu is a live-action film being released by Warner Brothers and is the story of a young man who comes across a Pikachu that he can understand, who sounds like he's speaking normal English, but the rest of the world hears Pika Pika. And that speaking voice is, in fact, being lent by Ryan Reynolds. It's a little weird to see a character with Deadpool's voice, certainly, but it sounds like he's taken to the role fairly well. In fact, the only thing I could say is that he's maybe not quite hard-boiled enough to be a detective, but we'll have a chance to see exactly what kind of movie it is when it comes out next year. The reason this is such a big deal is because it's been 25 years this year. Oh, my phone seems to think I have asked it something. Just anyway, 25 years ago, Super Mario Brothers the movie came out. In 1993, I had been living here in Washington for less than a year when this movie came out, and I convinced my dad to take me to go see it, and I think he brought my sister with me. Dad was flying a lot at that time, so having, a Friday night or a weekend to go see a movie with him was kind of a treat. But that movie was weird. And that was one of the first times I realized that you could make something based on an idea that was only ever loosely influenced by that original idea and became something completely different. Now, Super Mario Brothers was not well loved at the box office or by critics. Most people thought the movie was confusing. It had very distinct visuals, but those visuals didn't match the game very closely. In fact, they didn't really match Hollywood very closely. It was sort of a precursor to a lot of crazy visual spectacle films that the 90s were full of, like the Romeo and Juliet film set in Miami, I think, somewhere in Florida. South Beach? I think it was South Beach even in Florida. I don't know. Tim Burton's Batman films had sort of set the stage for these very weird, sort of surrealist films. I'm trying to think of a few others. Demolition Man actually comes to mind, this warped vision of the future where crime has been practically abolished and people live very odd lives. There's a lot of distinct visuals in Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, although that might actually have been end of the 80s. It's hard for me to say. But Super Mario Brothers wasn't the first of these films, but it definitely was the first film where I realized how weird movies could be, if that makes any sense. And I sort of liked it, but at the time I remember being very disappointed that it wasn't more Super Mario-y. I had this idea of Super Mario being sort of cartoony from the cartoon that had been released over the previous few years. Super Mario Brothers, the film, was also sort of capitalizing on the Super Nintendo's popularity. The Super Nintendo was released 1990 or 91, I want to say, and I'd actually picked one up before we moved from Minnesota to Washington. So Nintendo was a great thing to be about and to enjoy, and this movie was something that everybody was really looking forward to, and it was being heavily publicized by the Nintendo Power magazine. And then when it came out, it was sort of people wanted to know if they were going to make a game based on it, and Nintendo was sort of, especially the Japanese branch of Nintendo, seemed to be like, no. But this Pokemon movie, while it's got some sort of surreal aspects to it, and certainly seeing Pokemon rendered in 3D in a way that makes them look like they're interacting with the natural world is bizarre. I think that if it sort of takes elements that work in live action and ignores elements that won't work in live action, that's going to be how it succeeds. And one of the best things about that trailer, and I highly recommend you go watch it, is that it opens with the musical cue from the title screen of the game. And I don't know how to put this. A lot of video game film adaptations suffer for not bothering to ever use any of the music from the games, because a lot of the times the music in the games are incredibly important to the entire presentation of the product. A game is not just identified by its characters. It's easy to forget that because you see the characters in print media, graphics, billboards, where there is no accompanying sound. But when you're actually playing the game, being able to hear that music is really important to sort of tie everything together. And so when movies like Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, or Super Mario Brothers themselves, or What's another example? Mortal Kombat, actually. These are films that almost totally do away with the original score from the video games. Um, and then on the other hand, while it's sort of a different beast, the Final Fantasy Advent Children film was made with much more of Square's direct involvement, and it actually covers a lot of music that was part of Final Fantasy VII. And I think that definitely works in its favor, especially considering the final battle between Cloud and Sephiroth takes place with One Winged Angel playing in the background. So I really hope that they aren't stopping at the trailer and they do try and include as many of those musical cues from Pokemon in the film as they can. But we'll see. Yeah, so this was a huge surprise and a nice way to sort of keep the day from being completely down in the dumps, having found out that Stan Lee passed. And my heart goes out to his family. He had a really good life, though, and let's keep looking forward to the future. Excelsior. I'm Eric Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.